Attorney General Barr took as long as he possibly could to hand over his redacted version of the Mueller report to Congress, but Congress has it now, which means the Republican-controlled Senate will try to ignore it for the most part, but the Democratically controlled House of Representatives must now take on the responsibility of dealing with the Mueller report, which Robert Mueller clearly anticipates in the report. He expects congressional action. It's very clear in the report that Robert Mueller expects Congress to be the next center of the action in the investigation of the president, including the possibility of impeachment, which is specifically mentioned by Mueller in the report, actual references to impeachment. And so we are fortunate tonight to have two members of the House Judiciary Committee joining us, including one member who is a presidential candidate, Eric Swalwell. They now have the responsibility of deciding whether the Mueller report has presented them with impeachable offenses by the President of the United States. They will join us later in this hour after we begin our discussion of the report with a mix of legal and political analysis. It is not possible to pick a most important line in the redacted version of the Mueller report because there are so many important lines about the proof that, quote, the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systematic fashion. There are so many lines that prove conclusively, quote, the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome. There are so many crucially important lines in the hundreds of pages of evidence that the President of the United States committed obstruction of justice. Those are the lines that the democratically controlled investigative committees in the House of Representatives will use as the basis of their continuing investigations of the president, while the Republican-controlled committees in the United States Senate will, to the extent that they can, just ignore the Mueller report. But the line in the Mueller report that tells you the most about Donald Trump, the person, and Donald Trump, the president, and Donald Trump, the obstruction of justice suspect, is the line that Donald Trump himself speaks when he is told that a special prosecutor has just been appointed to investigate Russian interference in the election and possible Russian interaction with the Trump campaign. One of the people in the Oval Office at the time was taking notes, and Robert Mueller obtained those notes. Robert Mueller also obtained under oath testimony from the person who wrote those notes and everyone else who was in the room, except Donald Trump, of course, who refused to speak to the special prosecutor. It was one of the many dramatic scenes described in the Mueller report. Days earlier, the president had fired FBI Director James Comey and believed that that would be the end of the Russia investigation and that the FBI was already conducting. The president was in the Oval Office with Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who had recused himself from supervising the Russia investigation. White House counsel Don McGahn was also in the room, along with Jeff Sessions' chief of staff Jody Hunt, who was taking the notes that Robert Mueller used to reconstruct the scene. They were there to conduct interviews for a new FBI director, and they didn't know that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who was supervising the Russia investigation now, had just appointed Robert Mueller as special counsel. Page 78, Volume 2 of the Mueller report. Sessions stepped out of the Oval Office to take a call from Rosenstein, who told him about the special counsel appointment, and Sessions then returned to inform the president of the news. According to notes written by Hunt, when Sessions told the president that a special counsel had been appointed, the president slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed." And that is who Donald Trump really is. He is the terrified man who has feared from the day Robert Mueller was appointed that it meant the end of his presidency. There was no tough guy in him when he heard about the special prosecutor, just fear and hopelessness. I'm effed. He obviously felt powerless. There was no confidence, no Trumpian bravado. The Mueller report notes that, quote, early the next morning, the president tweeted, "This is the single greatest witch hunt of a politician in American history!" Exclamation point. That's the public Trump, the witch hunt Trump. The private Trump, the real Trump, this is the end of my presidency. I'm effed. There are many lessons in that important line. First of all, the president is not as crazy as he publicly appears to be. That was a perfectly reasonable assessment of his situation by Donald Trump. Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed. That is a normal reaction from a person who realizes that a special prosecutor could ruin his life. He was right. Donald Trump is an unindicted co-conspirator tonight in a federal case in New York City, which was begun by Robert Mueller, a case in which Michael Cohen is going to prison for campaign crimes that he committed with Donald Trump and at the direction of Donald Trump, according to federal prosecutors in New York City. Donald Trump was right to think that things like the crimes that he committed with Michael Cohen would be the end of his presidency. Donald Trump knew what he was guilty of when he said, "This is the end of my presidency." Donald Trump knew all the things that he was hoping Robert Mueller would not find out about him or would not be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt about him. From a legal standpoint, Donald Trump's statement also shows what the law calls consciousness of guilt. And that consciousness of guilt, as expressed by the president, the second he found out a special prosecutor was on his case, is all the motivation he would need for what occupies half of the Mueller report, Donald Trump's obstruction of justice, as described in the evidence gathered by Robert Mueller. So in that one line, you have three big things. You have the real Donald Trump. You have consciousness of guilt. You have motivation for obstruction of justice. It is certainly the most dramatic line any character speaks in the entire Mueller report. When the miniseries is made, that line will be the end of an episode. The Mueller report is something entirely different from what Attorney General William Barr has been trying to portray it to be, including his highly misleading comments about it just this morning before anyone had read it. Knowing that it would be disproved hours later, the Attorney General tried to suggest this morning that Donald Trump was fully cooperative with Robert Mueller's investigation, when in fact he refused to be interviewed by the special prosecutor and tried to fire the special prosecutor and delivered messages through his lawyer that people should not cooperate with the special prosecutor. The Mueller report makes clear that the only reason Robert Mueller did not charge the president with obstruction of justice is the Justice Department policy against indicting a president. And even though Attorney General Barr absurdly echoed Donald Trump's no collusion chant this morning, hours later, we read on page 1 of the Mueller report that the investigation, quote, identified numerous links between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. The Mueller report spends hundreds of pages describing the links between Russians and Donald Trump, the Trump campaign, and the Trump family. Robert Mueller correctly points out that the word collusion has no legal meaning, and what he was charged with investigating was the possibility of provable criminal conspiracy between Russians and the Trump campaign. The report says, we applied the framework of conspiracy law, not the concept of collusion. And Robert Mueller says that within that legal framework, the prosecutors could not prove a Trump campaign conspiracy with Russians. Quote, the investigation did not establish that the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. A statement that the investigation did not establish particular facts does not mean there was no evidence of those facts. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.